Welcome to Unit 6 of the TESOL course at Southern Utah University. In this video we'll discuss grammar teaching. We'll talk about factors that influence grammar learning. We'll also talk about what kind of grammatical structures to teach. And we'll talk about different approaches to teaching grammar and providing error correction. As we've mentioned, grammar is one of the 4 language systems, along with pronunciation, vocabulary, and culture. When we think about grammar learning, we need to help students understand that this is a gradual process. We can't just expect to learn one structure and master it in a single lesson, but instead it's this recursive process where we start out with very simple conception of how the grammar works, and over time we're going to refine that mental model into something that allows for greater diversity and exceptions and differences across different dialects and across different registers. Let's talk about some different factors that can influence how learners are receptive to learning the grammar of a new language. The first one is L1. L1 is an abbreviation that's used in linguistics to refer to someone's first language. L2 refers to a second language or any language that's not the first language. So a student's first language can be helpful in learning the grammar of the target language. For example, if I were learning a language that had the same sentence order as my native language, then I can use that knowledge from my native language to help me construct grammatical structures in the new language. However, inevitably, our native language is always going to have some differences from the target language. And because of that, there are times where we may think that the target language functions like our native language, and it doesn't, and that's going to hinder us. So first language, you just need to be aware there's some ways that it can help, but there's other ways that if we're teaching a group of learners, we may help them recognize that it does not function the same way as their L1. Another factor is age. Adults actually tend to learn grammar better. Part of this is because adults already understand a grammar system of their native language, and they already have a good understanding of it. And they often expect to be taught and to learn grammar. They also have a greater capacity for abstract thought. So thinking about language as an actual object and that you can manipulate it and that there are patterns and rules is something adults are better at conceptualizing. Children, on the other hand, those are just harder things for most children. They take a more naturalistic approach to learning language, and they might not have the abstract thought capacity for really organizing grammar as well as adults can. As learners, proficiency in the target language also impacts how well they can learn the grammar of that language. So lower proficient students are just grappling with survival in the language. They just need memorized words and phrases. They're not so interested in the idea of understanding the grammar and creating with the language. But the more advanced they become, the higher their proficiency, the more they want to create with the language and manipulate the language to create new and novel sentences that they haven't memorized. And so they're more motivated and interested and ready to learn grammar. So when we're teaching lower levels, we might not want to do as much explicit grammar and keep it simple. Higher levels, we can get into more advanced discussions of grammar. A learner's educational background can have an impact. Those who have less education, including less literacy, may not be as interested in grammar and may have a more difficult time learning it. But the more education we have, especially literacy, the more likely we are to be able to conceptualize language as an object and be able to manipulate it and be interested in learning grammar and applying it. The last factor we want to take a look at is a learner's context for where they're going to use the language and their goals. If our goal is less formal and it's just sort of more survival, conversational, we may not have a very strong interest in learning grammar and probably wouldn't have a high need to learn grammar because our language community might be very flexible and very willing to accept non-standard grammatical forms, just as long as our message is clear. But those who have more academic or professional pursuits, the rules are stricter. That language community requires a strict adherence to the patterns of formal grammar. And so those learners are going to be more motivated to learn it because that's what their community is demanding. When we think about what kind of grammar we should teach, we need to take a look at what structures are the most useful and frequent. And those are the ones we should prioritize. There's lots of really unusual and specialized grammatical rules in any language, but if those aren't very common things that learners are going to use, it's probably not very worthwhile to spend a lot of time teaching those things. So find out what kind of tasks learners need to do, and then identify the structures that they need to be successful at those tasks. And as we do that, we need to identify what are the most difficult structures that are causing errors for our learners. If we know that this is a task that they all have to do, but it's an easy grammatical structure that they're all getting, we don't need to spend a lot of time teaching that. But if we know that there's a particular aspect of the language that's very difficult for learners to get, we might want to spend more time focusing on that one. So let's talk about some different methods and approaches to keep in mind as we teach grammar. First is that we want to try to teach grammar in sequence. And by what we mean here is teach simpler forms first and work our way towards more complex forms. We always want to make sure, as with any of the 4 language systems, that we teach in context. We teach language that is used for a communicative purpose. But then we teach the structure that helps make that communicative task easier. We also want to teach in response to error. So when we notice grammatical problems that are leading to confusion, those are great times to jump in and present a grammatical structure. If we can do that kind of incidental instruction, learners are going to be more motivated to acquire the grammatical structure because they can see that it really has an application to what they want to do. We should also look at using visuals. Because we're often dealing with very abstract concepts with grammar, using timelines to show how verb forms differ. We may also want to use other charts to show differences between different grammatical forms. Those types of visuals can help lots of learners. We can also use dialogues, the things that present grammatical structures to students and give them a model, some chunking of the language, and then they can take those dialogues and manipulate them, the idea of the chains and the slots, to create new and novel sentences. We also want to be careful about using meta-language. Meta-language is words that we use to describe language. These are the linguistic terms for grammar. And if our learners are not linguists themselves, they're not particularly interested in the linguistic aspect of grammar. They just want to use grammar in order to accomplish their communicative purpose. So we need to be careful about not overloading them with all that meta-language and finding simple ways to express the grammatical concepts that we want to teach them. It's important that we involve practice. It's not enough to just teach learners about grammar. We need to teach them to use grammar to accomplish useful things. And as we get them practicing, we don't just want them practicing rote memorization or reproduction of grammar. We want them to create new aspects of language as they're practicing. And that will get them applying the grammar and thinking about it more. Lastly, we want to make sure that we involve induction in our grammar teaching. Induction is where we would present some samples of language, and then we'd help learners analyze those samples of language to determine a rule or pattern that explains the grammatical structures. This helps learners think about language as a linguist and gets them becoming more independent grammar learners. The opposite of this would be just present a grammatical rule and say, here's the rule, follow the rule. But if we can get them to come up with the rule or the pattern, they're more likely to remember it and be able to use that same process to identify other grammatical patterns that we don't teach them. Let's talk for a moment about error correction. Just as there are researchers who suggest we should not explicitly teach grammar, many of those same researchers also suggest we should not correct grammatical errors in a language. Now, this is in a minority of linguists and language educators, but it is a point to be at least understood that there are some learners who don't respond well to grammar correction. So we need to be sensitive and find out who those learners are, and if they want to take a more naturalistic approach, just let them do that. And even when we do provide error correction, it needs to be supportive and constructive. We should never make a student feel like they're being attacked or overwhelmed that language is full of grammatical problems. We should use incidental feedback, as we mentioned. Provide feedback when the error arises so that the learner can understand how that feedback can improve their language. Recasting is a common form of error correction, and how recasting works is a student makes an error and we restate the statement with the correct form. So if someone were to say, I took the book, we would just say, you took the book, and help the learner notice the difference in those forms. And of course, we want to encourage self-correction. We want learners to become better at identifying their own errors and then fixing them. And you can do this with written or oral language. You have the student produce some language, and then you have them go back to review it. And you may talk specifically about, here's some forms that we've explicitly explained. I want you to go and review it and see if you have any errors with that. And as learners progress more likely are going to be able to identify their errors so that in the future when they're writing, they'll get better at incorporating that new grammatical structure into their natural flow of language production. So in this video, we talked about some different factors that can affect grammar learning. We talked about choosing grammatical structures to teach and providing feedback on grammar teaching and error correction.